Have you ever been so underestimated by someone that when they finally saw your true worth, all they could do was beg for your help? Today's story is about Morgan, a woman whose in-laws treated her like she was beneath them, until karma came around in the most satisfying way possible. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I never expected my life to turn into a rags-to-riches revenge story, but sometimes the universe has plans that surpass even our wildest imaginations. My name is Morgan Taylor, and 5 years ago I was a bright-eyed newlywed who thought she had hit the relationship jackpot. My husband, Ethan Powell, was everything I'd dreamed of: kind, ambitious, and seemingly from a good family. We met during my final year of business school at a campus networking event. While I was there representing my student entrepreneurship, Group Ethan was the guest speaker from a regional tech company. Our connection was instant, and within a year, we were engaged. Coming from a modest background in rural Michigan, I'd worked my way through college on scholarships and side jobs. My parents, a high school teacher and a nurse, had instilled in me a strong work ethic and the belief that character matters more than cash. By the time I met Ethan, I had an MBA from a state university, a solid business plan, and dreams of launching my own tech consulting firm. Ethan often bragged about his prestigious family, the Powells of Connecticut, who apparently had connections throughout the East Coast business world. From the way he described them, I pictured a warm, sophisticated clan who would welcome me with open arms and perhaps even mentor me in my entrepreneurial journey. "My dad's basically built half the commercial real estate in Hartford," Ethan would say, "and my mom sits on 3 different charitable foundation boards. You'll love them, and they'll absolutely adore you." When Ethan proposed, I was over the moon. The ring was impressive, a family heirloom that had belonged to his grandmother, and his promises about our future together were even more dazzling. "Together, we'll build something incredible," he'd whispered as he slipped the ring onto my finger. "My family has connections that can take your business ideas to the next level." Our wedding was small, but elegant. I noticed that very few of Ethan's family members attended, but he explained it away as scheduling conflicts and overseas business trips. In hindsight, that should have been my first red flag. After a brief honeymoon in Nantucket, we settled into our life together in a modest apartment in Boston. I was working for a mid-sized consulting firm while developing my business plan on the side, and Ethan had a decent role at a technology company. Our life wasn't luxurious, but we were comfortable and happy. Then came the invitation to Thanksgiving at the Powell family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. "It's time you meet everyone," Ethan said, looking oddly nervous. "Just don't take anything they say too personally, okay? They can be a bit traditional." The drive to Greenwich was tense. Ethan spent most of it coaching me on what to say, what not to say, which topics to avoid, and how to address his parents. By the time we pulled up to the imposing colonial mansion set back from the road behind a gated entrance, my stomach was in knots. "Remember," Ethan whispered as we walked up to the front door, carrying the homemade cranberry sauce I'd insisted on bringing. "My mom is very particular about her Thanksgiving. Just follow her lead." Patricia Powell opened the door herself, perfectly coiffed in a cashmere sweater and pearls. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she air-kissed Ethan on both cheeks before giving me a once-over. "You must be Morgan," she said, her voice dripping with a politeness that felt like ice water. "How interesting to finally meet you. Come in before you let all the heat out." The inside of the house was like something from a luxury magazine. Antique furniture, oil paintings, and what looked like genuine Persian rugs. I could feel my boots, practical for the November weather but clearly not expensive enough for this household, sinking into the plush carpet. "I bought cranberry sauce," I offered, holding out the crystal dish I'd carefully transferred it to. "It's my grandmother's recipe." Patricia eyed the dish like I was offering her a dead rat. "How thoughtful. I'm sure we can find some use for it. The kitchen is that way. She nodded toward a distant doorway without taking the dish. Confused, I stood there until Ethan gently took the dish from my hands. I'll take it to the kitchen, hun. Why don't you go meet my father in the living room? I found Richard Powell holding court in an opulent living room, surrounded by what I would later learn were Ethan's siblings, their spouses, and a few family friends. Richard was tall, silver-haired, and had the confident posture of someone who had never been told no in his life. "Ah, the new addition," he boomed when Ethan introduced me. He didn't stand up or offer his hand. "Ethan tells us you're from, where was it again? Some small town in Michigan?" "Lakewood," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just outside of Grand Rapids." "Charming," he replied in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "And what does your father do again?" "He's a high school history teacher," I said proudly. 30 years at the same school, and my mom's a nurse practitioner. The silence that followed was deafening. A woman who I later learned was Ethan's older sister, Abigail, actually snickered. "Well," Richard finally said, "I suppose someone has to educate the masses. Drink?" He held up a crystal decanter without really looking at me. The rest of the afternoon continued in much the same vein. I was alternately ignored or subjected to thinly veiled condescending remarks. Ethan's siblings, Abigail, Blake, and Whitney, seemed to take their cues from their parents, treating me with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. At one point, I overheard Abigail telling her husband, in what was clearly meant to be a stage, whisper, "I can't believe he actually married the scholarship case. Daddy's going to write him out of the will for sure." When we finally sat down to dinner, I was directed to a seat at the far end of the table, away from Ethan, who was placed between his mother and an elegant older woman introduced as his Aunt Cordelia. The conversation flowed around me, but never to me. They discussed people I'd never heard of, country clubs I'd never visited, and vacation homes I couldn't imagine owning. When I tried to join in with a comment about a recent business news item I'd read, Richard cut me off mid-sentence. "Let's not bore everyone with shop talk," he said dismissively. "Whitney, tell everyone about your new position on the symphony." Bored. Then came the moment that would forever be etched in my memory. I noticed Patricia signaling to one of the actual household staff, a woman who had been quietly refilling water glasses. The woman approached, and Patricia spoke to her in a low voice. A minute later, the woman approached me. "Mrs. Powell would like you to help bring out the dessert course," she said, looking uncomfortable. Confused but not wanting to make a scene, I followed her to the kitchen. There, Patricia was fussing over the arrangement of pies on silver trays. "Ah, Morgan," she said, barely glancing up. "Be a dear and take these out to the dining room. Start with Richard at the head of the table. Then work your way around clockwise. The help will assist you." I froze. "The help?" "Yes, Maria will show you how it's done. I assume you've waited tables before? Most scholarship students have some experience in service, don't they?" The realization hit me like a slap. She didn't want me to help with dessert as a family member. She was treating me as if I were part of the waitstaff. "Actually," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "I worked as a teaching assistant and research fellow during college. I've never been a server." Patricia looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, well, it's simple enough. Even someone from your background should be able to manage." I stood there, pie tray in hand, torn between the desire to dump it over her perfectly styled hair and the need to maintain my dignity. In the end, dignity won out. Barely. I served the pies as directed, acutely aware of the smirks exchanged between Abigail and Whitney. When I returned to my seat, Ethan's cousin Bryce, who was seated next to me, leaned over and whispered, "Don't worry. She did the same thing to my wife the first time she came to Thanksgiving. Patricia thinks anyone who didn't summer in the Hamptons as a child is basically the help." It wasn't much comfort. After what felt like an eternity, the meal finally ended. As guests moved to the living room for coffee and digestives, I found myself cornered by Ethan's Aunt Cordelia, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s with a no-nonsense attitude. "So you're the girl who's caused such a stir," she said, eyeing me over her glasses. "MBA from Michigan State, I hear. Planning to start a business?" A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Surprised that anyone had bothered to learn these details about me, I nodded. Yes, a tech consulting firm focused on helping small and medium-sized businesses implement enterprise-level solutions at affordable prices. "Interesting," she said, and unlike the others, she seemed to mean it. "The Powells have always been real estate and old money investments. Tech is progressive for this crowd." There was a glint in her eye that I couldn't quite interpret. Our conversation was cut short when Patricia announced it was time for the annual family discussion of year-end financial matters, a not-so-subtle way of clearing out non-family members. On the drive home, I finally let my composure break. "Your family thinks I'm beneath them," I said to Ethan, tears of humiliation and anger streaming down my face. "Your mother literally treated me like a servant." Ethan looked uncomfortable, but not surprised. "They're just old-fashioned, Morgan. They'll warm up to you eventually." "Old-fashioned? Your sister laughed at my father being a teacher, and your mother called me the help to my face." "She didn't mean it that way," Ethan said weakly. "It's just, they had certain expectations about who I would marry. Someone from our social circle, you know? Someone with connections. Someone rich," I said flatly. Ethan didn't deny it. "Look, once they get to know you, they'll see what I see. Just give it time." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as we drove back to our apartment in Boston, something had fundamentally changed. Not just in how I viewed his family, but in how I viewed Ethan himself. The man who had stood by silently, while his family humiliated me. That night, as Ethan slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I had two choices. I could try to win over the Powell family and potentially spend years being treated as a second-class citizen, or I could focus my energy on building something of my own, something so successful that even the Powells couldn't ignore it. By morning, I had made my decision. I would give Ethan one chance to stand up to his family. One chance to prove that our marriage mattered more to him than his inheritance or his family's approval. And if he couldn't do that, I would forge my own path, with or without him. Little did I know that this Thanksgiving disaster would be the catalyst for a complete transformation in my life. Within 3 years, the tables would turn so dramatically that the very people who had called me the help would be desperately seeking my assistance, not as family, but as potential employees. The road from that humiliating Thanksgiving to becoming one of Boston's most sought-after tech entrepreneurs wasn't easy or straightforward. It was paved with late nights, impossible decisions, heartbreak, and ultimately, the sweetest revenge, success on my own terms, and it all began Monday after Thanksgiving, when I walked into my office and tendered my resignation. My boss, Jennifer, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "You're quitting? In this economy? To do what exactly?" "To start my own company," I said with more confidence than I felt. "I've been developing the business plan for over a year. It's time." Jennifer leaned back in her chair and studied me. "Is this about your in-laws? Ethan mentioned you had a rough Thanksgiving with them." I was momentarily taken aback that Ethan had discussed our private matters with my boss, who he only knew casually through company events. "This isn't an emotional decision, if that's what you're implying. I've been planning this move for a long time." "All right," Jennifer said, surprising me. "Then let's talk about how to make this transition work for both of us, and maybe how my connections can help you get started." To my shock, Jennifer didn't try to talk me out of leaving. Instead, She offered to become my first client, contracting my new firm to handle a project she'd been struggling to staff. She also introduced me to a venture capitalist who specialized in women-led startups. "I've been watching you for 2 years, Morgan," Jennifer told me. "You have something special, a combination of technical knowledge and people skills that's rare in this industry. I'd rather have you as a valuable connection than lose you completely." With Jennifer's support, I secured a small office space and officially launched Taylor Tech Solutions the following month. The company name was deliberate. I used my maiden name, not Powell. This would be my creation, built on my reputation. Alone. When I told Ethan about my decision, his reaction was mixed. "I'm proud of you for taking the leap," he said cautiously. "But shouldn't we have discussed such a big financial risk together? And why use your maiden name? Would you prefer I use the Powell name? Leverage your family's connections?" I asked, knowing full well what his answer would be. Ethan paled. "God, no. My father would have a fit if you used the family name for a startup that might fail." "Exactly," I said quietly. "This needs to be all mine. Success or failure." The first 6 months were brutal. I worked 18-hour days, took meetings at all hours, and pitched my services to anyone who would listen. Ethan and I barely saw each other, and when we did, there was a new tension between us. He'd started making comments about my obsession with work and questioning when I would get past what happened at Thanksgiving. "It was just one bad day, Morgan," he said during one particularly heated argument. "Why can't you let it go?" "Because it wasn't just one day," I fired back. "It was a glimpse into how your family really sees me, how they'll always see me unless I prove them wrong." Ethan threw up his hands. "So that's what this company is about? Proving my family wrong?" I paused, considering his question seriously. "No," I finally said. "It started that way maybe, but now it's about proving something to myself." By the end of my first year in business, Taylor Tech Solutions had landed 3 major clients and expanded to a team of 5. I had developed a niche in helping mid-sized traditional businesses modernize their operations through custom tech solutions that didn't require enterprise-level budgets. One evening, as I was working late at the office, I received an unexpected visitor, Ethan's Aunt Cordelia. "Your receptionist has gone home," she announced, striding into my office like she owned it. "You should lock your front door after hours." I blinked in surprise. "Aunt Cordelia? How did you find my office?" "I'm old, not incompetent," she sniffed. "I can use Google." She settled into the chair opposite my desk and fixed me with a penetrating gaze. "I've been following your progress. You've done remarkably well for someone with no family connections." Coming from anyone else, this might have sounded like an insult. From Cordelia, it was high praise. "Thank you," I said cautiously. "What brings you here?" "I want to hire you," she said bluntly. "Not for Patricia's sake. God knows that woman needs far more help than you could provide. For my own business interests." Apparently, Aunt Cordelia wasn't just a society matron. She owned a significant property management company that she had built herself after her husband died 30 years ago. While the rest of the Powells looked down on actual work, Cordelia had been quietly amassing her own fortune separate from the family money. "The company's technology is archaic," she admitted. "I need someone who understands both the technical side and the human side of modernization. Someone who won't make my staff of 30 years feel obsolete while bringing us into the current century." It was exactly the kind of project my company specialized in. We spent the next hour discussing her needs, and by the time she left, Taylor Tech Solutions had landed its biggest client yet. As Cordelia was leaving, she paused at the door. "The family doesn't know I'm here," she said. "And they certainly don't know I'm hiring you. I'd like to keep it that way for now." I nodded, understanding perfectly. "Our contract will be with your company, not with you personally. Cordelia Winthrop is a common enough name." Cordelia's project became the cornerstone that transformed Taylor Tech Solutions from a promising startup into a genuine contender in Boston's competitive tech consulting landscape. Her property management company had over 50 buildings across New England, and modernizing their systems meant a six-figure contract that allowed me to hire 3 more employees and move to a larger office space. What I didn't expect was how word would spread through Boston's tight-knit business community. By the end of our second year, we had a waiting list of clients and had expanded to a team of 15. I was no longer just the CEO. I was becoming a recognized name in tech entrepreneurship circles. Meanwhile, my marriage was deteriorating. Ethan had initially been supportive of my venture, but as my company grew more successful, his attitude shifted. He began making cutting remarks about my long hours and suggesting that my success was just beginner's luck or due to a market bubble. "When are you going to be satisfied?" he asked one night after I missed yet another dinner with his colleagues. "You've proven your point. You can start a business. Now maybe scale back and focus on our life together?" We were sitting in our kitchen, the remains of takeout containers between us. The third time that week we'd eaten dinner after 9 p.m. "Proven my point?" I echoed incredulously. "This isn't about making a point, Ethan. This is my career, my passion. Would you scale back if you were seeing this kind of success?" His silence was answer enough. The final straw came during our third Christmas as a married couple. Ethan insisted we attend the annual Powell family holiday gala at his parents' estate, despite my reluctance after the Thanksgiving debacle. "Things will be different this time," he promised. "You're not just my new wife anymore. They'll see you differently." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I even bought a new dress for the occasion. A sleek, midnight blue designer gown that cost more than I would have dreamed of spending before my business took off. As we walked into the Powell mansion, I noticed subtle changes in how I was received. Patricia's greeting was slightly warmer, and Richard actually stood to shake my hand. It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but it was a marked improvement from being mistaken for the waitstaff. The reason for this shift became clear a few minutes later when an older man approached me with an outstretched hand. "Morgan Taylor, I presume? Walter Davidson. I've heard remarkable things about your work with Cordelia's properties." Walter, as it turned out, was a longtime business associate of the Powell family and on the board of directors for their real estate development company. Before I could respond, Patricia materialized at my side, looping her arm through mine as if we were old friends. "Walter, I see you've met our Morgan," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Such a creative little business she's built. We're all so proud." I nearly choked on my champagne. Proud? This woman who had treated me like a servant was now claiming family pride in my accomplishments? Walter seemed genuinely interested in my company, asking insightful questions about our technology stack and scalability plans. I was deep in conversation with him when Patricia interrupted again. "Morgan, darling, you simply must speak with Maxwell Pierce. He's having the most dreadful time with his company's systems integration." For the next hour, I found myself being paraded around the party and introduced to various wealthy business people, all of whom mysteriously had technology problems that needed solving. It dawned on me that the Powells weren't proud of me. They were trying to use me. My success was now something they could leverage in their social circle. When I finally caught a moment alone with Ethan, I confronted him. "Did you know about this? That your parents were planning to use me as their personal tech consultant tonight?" Ethan had the grace to look embarrassed. "They mentioned inviting a few friends who might benefit from your expertise. I thought you'd appreciate the connections." "Connections?" I hissed. "Your mother is literally pimping out my professional services at a cocktail party without my consent. These people are trying to get free consulting work out of me while sipping eggnog." "Don't be dramatic," Ethan said, lowering his voice as a couple walked past. "It's networking. Isn't that what you entrepreneurs do?" "On my terms," I said firmly. "Not as the dancing monkey at your family's holiday party." By the time We left. I had 17 business cards in my evening bag and not a single genuine conversation to show for the night. In the car ride home, Ethan attempted to spin the evening as a positive. See? They respect you now. This is progress. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. They don't respect me, Ethan. They see me as useful. There's a difference. The next morning, I made a decision. I called each and every one of those 17 people and scheduled proper business meetings. If the Powells wanted to use my success, I would make sure it was on my terms and with signed contracts that benefited my company. By the end of January, Taylor Tech Solutions had landed 5 new high-profile clients from those holiday party connections. We were growing so rapidly that I had to lease an entire floor in our office building and begin an aggressive hiring spree. It was during this period of expansion that I received an unexpected email from Blake Powell, Ethan's younger brother. The subject line read simply, "Business proposition." Blake had always been the quietest of the Powell siblings. At family gatherings, he tended to hang back, observing rather than participating in the casual cruelty his sisters seemed to relish. I had never spoken to him at length, but he had never been overtly rude to me either. His email was surprisingly humble. "I've been following your company's growth and I'm impressed. I have a master's in computer science that I've never put to good use in the family business. Would you consider meeting to discuss potential opportunities at Taylor Tech?" My first instinct was to suspect a trick. Was this some elaborate Powell family scheme to infiltrate my business? I showed the email to my COO, Darius, who had been with me since the early days. "Could be legit," Darius said thoughtfully. "The guy has solid credentials according to LinkedIn. Stanford CS degree, some project work with notable names. Even if he is a spy, we could always just show him the door if he tries anything funny." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet Blake for coffee. To my surprise, he showed up alone, dressed in an understated button-down and chinos rather than the bespoke suits his father and brother favored. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, noticeably nervous. "I wouldn't blame you if you'd deleted my email without reading it." "I almost did," I admitted. "Why the sudden interest in working with me, Blake? Last I checked, your family thinks tech consulting is beneath the Powell dignity." Blake sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "That's my father's view, not mine. I've been the family disappointment since I chose computer science over finance or law. The only reason Dad tolerates me is because he needs someone to handle the technology side of the family business, but he never actually listens to my recommendations." As our conversation continued, I realized there was more to Blake than I had assumed. Unlike his sisters, who had fully embraced the family's elitism, Blake seemed genuinely uncomfortable with his privileged background. He had ideas about using technology for social good and had been quietly volunteering his skills for several nonprofits. "I saw what happened at Thanksgiving 2 years ago," he confessed, "and at every family event since. The way they treated you was inexcusable." I should have said something, and I'm sorry I didn't. "Why didn't you?" I asked bluntly. "Cowardice," he admitted. "Fear of being cut off like my cousin Sophia was when she married beneath her station? It's not an excuse, but it's the truth." By the end of our meeting, I was intrigued enough to offer Blake a 3-month trial position as a project manager. His technical skills were solid, and having someone who understood the inner workings of old money businesses could be an asset when dealing with clients from that world. "I'll pay you the standard market rate for your experience level," I told him. "No special treatment, positive or negative. You'll be judged solely on your work." Blake surprised me by looking relieved rather than offended. "That's all I've ever wanted, to be valued for what I can do, not who my family is." When Ethan found out I had hired his brother, he was livid. "You're turning my family against me," he accused. "First Aunt Cordelia, now Blake. What's next? Going to offer my father a job as your janitor?" "Your family members sought me out," I reminded him. "And they're adults making their own decisions. Why does it bother you so much that they respect my business acumen? Because it's changing the family dynamic, Ethan exploded. Dad keeps asking why I'm not more involved in your company's growth. He actually suggested I might be riding your coattails instead of building my own career. The irony was almost too perfect. Richard Powell, who had barely acknowledged my existence at our first meeting, was now measuring his son against my success. Blake proved to be an excellent addition to the team. He had a knack for translating complex technical concepts into language that technophobic executives could understand, and his insider knowledge of how traditional companies operated helped us refine our service offerings. At the end of his 3-month trial, I offered him a permanent position with a generous equity package. Blake accepted without hesitation. "My father's going to disown me," he said with a smile that suggested this might not be entirely unwelcome. "Are you prepared for that?" I asked seriously. Blake nodded. "I've been preparing for it my whole life. I've got savings, and unlike my siblings, I never expected to coast on my inheritance. Besides," he added with a grin, "the way your company is growing, this equity might be worth more than my trust fund someday." As predicted, Richard and Patricia did not take the news well. Ethan received a blistering phone call from his father, demanding that he control your wife and force me to fire Blake immediately. Ethan, to his credit, finally found his backbone. "Morgan doesn't answer to me, Dad. She's built a successful company without any help from our family. If anything, you should be thanking her for giving Blake a chance to prove himself." The tension between our families reached a breaking point when the Powell family's flagship real estate development company, Powell Properties, suffered a catastrophic data breach. Their outdated systems had been vulnerable for years, according to Blake, despite his warnings to his father. The breach exposed sensitive client information and internal financial documents that suggested some questionable accounting practices. The Powell family reputation, built over generations, was suddenly at risk of collapse. 3 days after the news broke, I received a call from Richard Powell himself. "Morgan," he said, his voice lacking its usual imperious tone, "I believe we need to discuss a potential business arrangement." "I'm listening," I said neutrally, giving nothing away. "Powell Properties requires assistance with our technological infrastructure," he said, clearly struggling with the words. "Blake suggests your firm is the best equipped to handle our needs." "I see," I replied. "And what exactly are you proposing, Richard?" There was a pause on the line. "A consulting contract, full system overhaul, whatever it takes to ensure this never happens again." "That would be a substantial project," I said carefully. "Our waiting list for new clients is currently 6 months long." 6 months? Richard sounded genuinely shocked. "That's impossible. We need this fixed immediately. The company's reputation is important to you," I finished for him. "Just as my company's reputation is important to me. I don't rush projects or bump clients without good reason." After a lengthy silence, Richard spoke again, his voice almost unrecognizable in its humility. "What would it take to move us up the list?" I allowed myself a moment to savor the irony. 3 years ago, this man couldn't be bothered to stand up, to greet me. Now he was practically begging for my help. "I'd need to pull my top team off other projects," I said. "That means paying premium rates, about 50% above our standard fees. And I'd need complete autonomy to implement whatever changes are necessary without interference." "That's highway robbery," Richard sputtered, a flash of his old self emerging. "That's business," I corrected him. "You're not just paying for the work, you're paying for the privilege of jumping ahead of equally important clients. Take it or leave it." After another long pause, Richard agreed to my terms. By the end of the week, I had a signed contract with Powell Properties worth over $1 million, more than my entire first year of business revenue. The day after the contract was signed, I received a text message from Abigail, Ethan's older sister who had mocked my scholarship background at that first Thanksgiving. "Lunch tomorrow? We should talk. Curious, I agreed to meet her at an upscale restaurant in downtown Boston. Abigail arrived 15 minutes late, dressed impeccably and radiating the same superficial charm I remembered. "Morgan, darling," she gushed, air kissing, near my cheeks. "You look fabulous. Success suits you." "Thank you," I said, not bothering to return the false compliment. "What did you want to discuss, Abigail?" She waved over a waiter and ordered a martini before answering. "I'll get straight to the point. I'm considering a career change, and I thought of you." I raised an eyebrow. "Me?" "Your company," she clarified. "I have a degree in communications from Vassar, and I've been handling the PR for several of Daddy's charity events over the years. I thought perhaps you might need someone with my skills and connections." I studied her carefully. Unlike Blake, whose genuine passion for technology had been evident, Abigail showed no real interest in my company's work. What she wanted was the prestige of being associated with a fast-growing firm and perhaps a shortcut to rebuilding the family fortune if Richard's company continued to struggle. "What specifically interests you about tech consulting, Abigail?" I asked. She blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. "Well, it's the future, isn't it? And your company in particular is doing so well." "And that Thanksgiving when you laughed at my background? When your mother treated me like hired help? What's changed since then?" Abigail had the grace to look embarrassed, though I suspected it was more about being confronted than about her actual behavior. "Water under the bridge," she said with a dismissive wave. "We all make mistakes. I didn't really know you then." "You didn't try to know me," I corrected her. "And I'm not sure you're trying now. You want a job, not a relationship." "Isn't that what business is?" she asked, genuinely confused. "Transactions, not emotions." At that moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Abigail had been raised to see every interaction as a transaction, every relationship as a potential advantage or liability. She truly didn't understand why her past behavior mattered in a professional context. Taylor Tech Solutions hires based on merit, passion, and cultural fit. I told her, "I'd be happy to have you submit a formal application like any other candidate, but I should warn you that our hiring process is rigorous, and our company values include authenticity and humility." Abigail's smile faltered. "But surely, as family..." "We're not family, Abigail," I said gently. "We're potential business associates, and in business, I don't give preferential treatment based on personal connections." She left shortly after, her martini barely touched. I doubted I would receive her application, and I was right. What I didn't expect was the phone call from Whitney, the middle Powell sibling, the very next day. Unlike Abigail's lunch invitation, Whitney was direct. "Is it true you turned down Abigail for a job?" "I invited her to apply through our standard process," I clarified. "She chose not to." Whitney laughed, a surprisingly genuine sound. "That sounds like Abby. She's never filled out an application in her life." After a pause, she continued, "I'm not calling for a job. I'm calling because I'm impressed. Not many people stand up to the Powell family, especially not twice." "Twice?" "First by succeeding despite their expectations, then by refusing to let them use that success on their terms. It's refreshing." It was the beginning of an unexpected alliance. Whitney, I would learn, had been the family rebel long before I came along. She had rejected the debutante path laid out for her, gotten a law degree against her father's wishes, and was now working as a public defender, a career choice that mortified Patricia almost as much as Blake's decision to work in tech. As the weeks passed, the Powell family dynamics continued to shift. Richard's company slowly recovered from the data breach, thanks largely to the systems my team implemented. Blake thrived at Taylor Tech, eventually becoming our CTO. Whitney and I developed a genuine friendship based on our shared experience of being underestimated. And Ethan? That's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. I'd like to say that Ethan rose to the occasion as our lives transformed, that he became my greatest champion as Taylor Tech Solutions grew from a startup into a major player in Boston's tech scene. But the truth is more complicated. As my professional star rose, Ethan's began to dim. The tech company where he worked underwent a restructuring, and while he wasn't laid off, he was passed over for a promotion he'd been counting on. His confidence took a hit, and instead of leaning on me for support, he grew distant. "You wouldn't understand," he said when I tried to talk to him about it. "Everything you touch turns to gold these days." The irony wasn't lost on me. When we first met, Ethan had been an established professional with family connections while I was a scholarship student with big dreams. Now our roles had reversed, and he seemed to be struggling with the shift. The situation came to a head 6 months after the Powell Properties contract, when I was invited to give a keynote speech at the New England Technology Leadership Conference, an honor usually reserved for established industry veterans, not relatively new entrepreneurs. I was thrilled, seeing it as validation of everything I'd built. Ethan's response was tepid at best. "Another networking event? Don't you have enough clients already?" "It's not about getting clients," I tried to explain. "It's about sharing what we've learned, contributing to the industry conversation." He rolled his eyes. "Right. Nothing to do with building the Morgan Taylor brand." I stared at him, hurt by the cynicism in his voice. "When did you become so bitter about my success?" "When it becomes the only thing that matters to you," he shot back. We argued late into the night, rehashing old tensions and unearthing new ones. By morning, we were both exhausted, with nothing resolved. The conference was a week away when I received a surprising call from Patricia Powell. "Morgan, dear," she said with the forced warmth I'd come to recognize. "I understand you're speaking at the technology leadership event next week." "That's right," I said cautiously, wondering how she even knew about it. "Wonderful. Richard and I would love to attend. Perhaps we could all have dinner afterward, to celebrate your achievement." I nearly dropped the phone. "You want to come to my speech and have dinner?" "Of course," Patricia said as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're family, after all." Family. The word rang hollow after years of being treated like an outsider. But curiosity got the better of me. "I'll have 2 tickets set." "Aside for you," I said. "Dinner would be interesting." When I told Ethan about the call, he looked skeptical. "They've never attended any of my work events. Why start with yours?" "Maybe they're trying to make amends," I suggested, not believing it myself. Ethan snorted. "More likely they want to show off their connection to you now that you're becoming a name in the industry. Classic Powell move, taking credit for success they had nothing to do with." His cynicism bothered me, not because it was wrong, but because it reflected how much he had changed. The optimistic, kind man I'd married was disappearing, replaced by someone resentful and jaded. The day of the conference arrived, and to my surprise, not only did Richard and Patricia show up, but they brought Abigail and her husband as well. They sat in the front row, smiling up at me with an enthusiasm that felt performative. My speech focused on how tech consulting could help traditional businesses adapt to rapid market changes without losing their core identity, a philosophy that had defined Taylor Tech's approach from day one. The audience response was overwhelmingly positive, with a standing ovation that left me momentarily speechless. As promised, dinner followed. We went to an upscale restaurant where Richard insisted on ordering champagne to toast Morgan's remarkable achievement. "You've come so far," Patricia said, her smile tight but her eyes calculating. "Who would have thought that day at Thanksgiving that you'd become such a sensation in the business world?" I met her gaze steadily. "I would have. That's why I started my company." Richard chuckled. "Always had that fire, didn't she, Ethan? You were smart to snap her up when you did." Ethan, who had been notably quiet all evening, took a long sip of his wine before responding. Morgan doesn't need anyone. To snap her up, Dad. She's not a commodity. An awkward silence fell over the table. Of course not, Richard backpedaled. Just a figure of speech. We're all very proud of what Morgan has accomplished. Are you? I asked, suddenly tired of the pretense. Because I remember quite clearly being treated like I wasn't good enough for this family, being mistaken for the help, being laughed at because my father is a teacher. Patricia had the grace to look uncomfortable. That was a misunderstanding. We were still getting to know you. No, I said firmly. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a clear message about where I stood in the Powell hierarchy. What's changed isn't your opinion of me. It's my value to you. Richard's mask of congenial pride slipped momentarily. Now see here. I'm not finished, I interrupted, surprising myself with my boldness. I appreciate that you came tonight. I'm even willing to believe that you're genuinely impressed with what I've built. But let's not pretend that this dinner is about family reconciliation. It's about business, same as it always has been with the Powells. Abigail, who had been silently watching the exchange, suddenly laughed. She's got you there, Daddy. We are. Trying to ride her coattails. Richard shot his daughter with a warning look, but the damage was done. At least Abigail's honest about it, I said. Ethan pushed his chair back from the table. I need some air. He walked out of the restaurant without looking back. I found him outside, leaning against the building's facade, staring up at the night sky. I'm sorry, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. Don't be, he replied, still not looking at me. You're right about them. You've always been right about them. Then why are you upset? He finally turned to face me, his expression a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. Because you're right about me, too. I've changed, and not for the better? What do you mean? I resent your success, he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him, not because I don't think you deserve it, but because it's highlighted all the ways I've been coasting, relying on my family name instead of pushing myself, expecting things to come easily because they always have. His honesty took me by surprise. Ethan! No, let me finish. When we met, I was attracted to your drive, your authenticity, the fact that you knew exactly who you were and what you wanted. I thought some of that would rub off on me. Instead, I've been pulling in the opposite direction, trying to drag you down to where I am, because it's easier than doing the work to rise to where you are. We stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city creating a backdrop to this unexpected moment of clarity. What happens now? I finally asked. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. I don't know, but I do know I need to figure out who I am outside of the Powell name and outside of being Morgan Taylor's husband. And I don't think I can do that while living in your shadow. 2 weeks later, Ethan moved out of our apartment. We called it a trial separation, but we both knew it was more than that. He took a job in Chicago, his first position ever secured without family connections or influence. In the months that followed, Taylor Tech Solutions continued to thrive. We expanded to new offices in New York and San Francisco. Blake was flourishing as our CTO, and Aunt Cordelia had become something of a mentor to me, offering wisdom that went beyond business into life lessons. Men like Richard and women like Patricia only understand power, she told me over lunch one day. You've changed the power dynamic, and they're still adjusting. The question is, what will you do with that power now that you have it? It was a question I contemplated often. Revenge had been a powerful motivator in the beginning, but it felt hollow now. Success was sweeter when it wasn't about proving something to others. 1 year after our separation, Ethan called to say he was coming back to Boston for a visit. I'd like to see you, he said. If you're willing? We met at a small cafe where we'd had our third date years ago. Ethan looked different somehow, more grounded, more present. You look well, I said, meaning it. "I am well," he replied. "For the first time in a long time. The job in Chicago has been good for me. I'm building something on my own merits, making my own contacts." "I'm glad," I said sincerely. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "My family's been through some changes too. Did you hear about my father?" I shook my head. He had a minor heart attack 3 months ago. It's forced him to slow down, reevaluate things. He's actually talking about retirement. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "Is he okay?" Ethan nodded. "Physically? Yes. Emotionally, it's been an adjustment. He built his identity around Powell Properties. The idea of stepping back has been harder than the health scare itself. I could understand that. Our work often becomes intertwined with our sense of self. And your mother? She's evolving, believe it or not. The heart attack scared her too. Made her realize there are more important things than social standing." He paused. "She asked about you, actually. Wanted to know if you'd be willing to have lunch with her someday." I raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Really," he confirmed. "Though I told her not to expect miracles. You've got every right to keep your distance after how they treated you." We talked for hours, catching up on our separate lives and reflecting on what had gone wrong in our marriage. There was no anger now, just a quiet acknowledgement that we had grown in different directions. As we prepared to leave, Ethan reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm proud of you, Morgan, not just for the success, but for how you've handled everything. My family, our separation, all of it. You've shown more grace than any of us deserved." I squeezed his hand before letting go. "We all do the best we can with what we have. I think you're finally doing that too." I didn't know if reconciliation with Ethan was in the cards, or if a civil relationship with the Powell family was possible. What I did know was that the frightened, insecure woman, who had been humiliated at that Thanksgiving dinner, was gone forever. In her place stood someone who had learned that true success isn't measured by wealth or social acceptance, but by the impact we have on the world around us, and the strength we find within ourselves when faced with those who would diminish us. The year following my cafe reunion with Ethan marked a period of unprecedented growth for Taylor Tech Solutions. Our client roster expanded beyond New England to include companies across the country, and our team grew to over 60 employees. I was no longer just running a successful local business. I was building something with national reach. With success came new challenges. I found myself traveling constantly, speaking at conferences from San Francisco to Miami, and meeting with potential clients who had heard about our reputation for transforming traditional businesses through thoughtful tech integration. Between trips, I managed to have that lunch with Patricia Powell. We met at a small bistro of my choosing, neutral ground, away from the opulence of her world or the sleek professionalism of mine. She arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably but more subdued than I remembered. The heart attack had aged Richard, she told me, and by extension had aged her too. "It's forced us to consider our legacy," she said, carefully arranging her napkin in her lap. "Not just the financial aspects, but what we're leaving behind in terms of relationships, family." I sipped my water, neither encouraging or discouraging this line of conversation. "I owe you an apology, Morgan," she continued, visibly uncomfortable but pressing on. "My behavior, our family's behavior toward you was inexcusable. I was protecting a way of life I thought was important, maintaining social boundaries that seemed vital at the time." "And now?" I prompted when she paused. Patricia sighed. "Now I find myself wondering what those boundaries cost us. Blake is thriving in your company, happier than I've ever seen him. Whitney speaks of you with genuine admiration. Even Abigail has mentioned that perhaps she misjudged you. And Richard?" A flicker of something, pain, perhaps, or resignation, crossed her face. "Richard is adapting. The heart attack reminded him of his mortality in ways nothing else could have. He's stepping back from Powell Properties, letting a management team handle day-to-day operations. That must be difficult for him, I observed, surprising myself with the genuine sympathy I felt. Patricia nodded. More than he'll admit. His identity has been so wrapped up in the company for so long. He's struggling to find purpose. We talked for nearly 2 hours, covering ground I never expected to traverse with Patricia Powell. She spoke of her own upbringing, the rigid expectations placed on her as the daughter of a banking family, the limited options available to women of her generation in their social circle. Not excuses for her behavior, but context that helped me understand it. By the time we said goodbye, we weren't friends, but we had reached a kind of understanding. Patricia had extended an olive branch, and I had chosen to accept it, not out of any obligation, but because holding on to resentment no longer served me. A month after our lunch, I received an unexpected email from Richard Powell himself. The subject line read simply, "Consulting inquiry, personal." Curious, I opened it to find a surprisingly humble message. "Morgan, I find myself in need of professional guidance as I transition out of my role at Powell Properties. Patricia suggested you might be willing to advise me on establishing a charitable foundation focused on supporting first-generation college students and entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. While I understand our history makes this request presumptuous, I believe your perspective would be invaluable. Your journey from scholarship student to industry leader embodies the very spirit this foundation aims to support. Would you consider meeting to discuss this possibility? Respectfully, Richard Powell." I stared at the screen, rereading the message several times. Richard Powell wanted my advice? On a foundation supporting students like I had been? The irony was almost too perfect. After careful consideration, I agreed to meet with him. We arranged to have coffee at a quiet corner table in the lobby of my office building, my territory, where the power dynamic was clear. Richard arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in his usual bespoke suit but somehow diminished compared to the imperious figure who had once looked down his nose at my father's profession. The heart attack had left its mark not just in the slight pallor of his complexion, but in the way he carried himself, more cautious, less commanding. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, extending his hand. His handshake was firm but not overbearing, a subtle shift from the power grip I remembered. "Your email intrigued me," I admitted as we settled into our seats. "A foundation for first-generation students isn't what I expected from Powell Enterprises." "Not Powell Enterprises," he corrected gently. "This would be separate. The Richard and Patricia Powell Foundation. Something personal, not corporate." I raised an eyebrow. "Why the sudden interest in supporting scholarship students? As I recall, my academic achievements were barely worth acknowledging when we first met." To his credit, Richard didn't flinch from the reference to our past interactions. "I deserved that," he acknowledged. "My views were limited, shaped by a lifetime of certain privileges and assumptions. And now?" He gazed out the window for a moment before answering. "Now, I find myself questioning much of what I've valued throughout my life. Success defined solely by wealth and status feels hollow when you're lying in a hospital bed, wondering if you'll see another sunrise." The conversation that followed was unlike any I could have imagined having with Richard Powell. He spoke candidly about how facing his mortality had forced him to examine his legacy. How watching Blake flourish at Taylor Tech had made him reconsider his narrow definition of success. How my own achievements had challenged his assumptions about what determined a person's worth and potential. "I judged you by your background, not your capabilities," he admitted. "It was not only unfair, but fundamentally foolish from a business perspective. I lost the opportunity to connect with your talent years earlier because of my prejudice." His directness was disarming. This wasn't Richard Powell who had dismissed my father's career with a condescending remark, or the man who had tried to leverage my success for his own social capital. This was someone humbled by circumstance, genuinely seeking to make amends. "What exactly are you looking for from me, Richard?" I asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. "Initially, your expertise on structuring the foundation," he replied. "But beyond that, your perspective. You've navigated both worlds, from scholarship, student to CEO. You understand the challenges in a way I never will, despite my best intentions." I considered his request carefully. Part of me, the part that still remembered the sting of being mistaken for waitstaff at that Thanksgiving dinner, wanted to dismiss it outright, but the businesswoman in me recognized a genuine opportunity to effect change. "I'll consider serving as a consultant for the Foundation's establishment," I said finally. "But I have conditions." Richard leaned forward, attentive. "Name them." "First, this can't be a vanity project. If you're serious about supporting first-generation students and entrepreneurs, the Foundation needs substantial funding and a sustainable structure." He nodded. "Already planned. I'm prepared to seed it with $20 million from my personal assets." The figure gave me pause. It was significant enough to suggest genuine commitment. "Second," I continued, "the Foundation should be led by someone with lived experience, not just wealthy donors with good intentions. You need a director who understands what it's like to be the scholarship kid, the outsider. Do you have recommendations?" "Several," I confirmed. "But that leads to my third condition. I won't be a figurehead or a token success story. If I'm involved, I expect to have meaningful input on the Foundation's direction and operations." Richard considered this for a moment before nodding again. "That's precisely why I'm here. Your input wouldn't be a token. It would be essential." We spent the next hour outlining a preliminary framework for the Foundation. Richard's business acumen complemented my understanding of the target demographic's needs. By the time we parted, I had agreed to help establish the organization and serve on its board, though I made it clear my primary focus would remain Taylor Tech Solutions. News of my involvement with the Powell Foundation spread quickly through Boston's business community. Most viewed it as a natural evolution of the relationship between our families, unaware of the complex history that made this collaboration so unexpected. Blake was supportive but cautious when I told him about the project. "Dad seems sincere," he said. "But old habits die hard. Just be careful, okay?" Whitney was more enthusiastic. "Maybe this is his version of redemption," she suggested during one of our regular coffee meetings. "Not that it erases the past, but people can change if given the right motivation." Aunt Cordelia, ever the pragmatist, saw it in strategic terms. "Richard's smart enough to know that attaching his name to your star adds luster to his legacy. But that doesn't mean good can't come from it. Let him fund the Foundation. The students won't care about his motives when they're receiving scholarships." Ethan's reaction was the one that surprised me most. He had returned to Boston 6 months. After our cafe meeting, taking a position with a green energy startup that had nothing to do with his family's connections. We had been cautiously rebuilding a friendship, meeting occasionally for coffee or lunch and carefully navigating our new dynamic. "I never thought I'd see the day my father asked for your help," he said when I told him about the Foundation. "It's actually pretty amazing to witness." "Is it weird for you?" I asked. "This new relationship between your family and me?" Ethan considered the question thoughtfully. "It was at first," he admitted. "But it feels right somehow. Like all of us finding our proper places in relation to each other." Our conversation shifted to his new role, the challenges and satisfaction he was finding in building something on his own merit. He spoke with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen since our early dating days, a genuine passion that had nothing to do with family expectations or inherited privilege. As we prepared to leave, Ethan hesitated, then asked, "Would you like to have dinner sometime? Not just coffee or lunch, but an actual evening out?" The question caught me off guard. Are you asking me on a date, Ethan Powell? He smiled, a flash of his old charm tinged with new humility. I guess I am. We've both changed so much. I thought maybe we could get to know each other again, not as the people we were, but as the people we've become. I found myself saying yes, curious about what it would be like to connect with this evolved version of the man I had once married. Our first date was nothing like the polished, impressive outings that had characterized our early courtship. Instead of an exclusive restaurant with a 3-month waiting list, Ethan chose a quirky neighborhood bistro run by a chef who had left a Michelin-starred kitchen to pursue his own culinary vision. The parallel wasn't lost on me. I come here at least once a week, Ethan told me as we settled into our table. Justin, the chef, remortgaged his house to open this place rather than taking investor money that would have compromised his vision. I admire that kind of conviction. Throughout dinner, we talked about everything but our past. Ethan spoke about his work with the green energy startup, the challenges of entering a field where he had no prior expertise, the satisfaction of earning respect through effort rather than family connections. I shared stories about Taylor Tech's expansion, the new mentorship program I had established for women in tech, and my vision for the company's future. By dessert, I realized I was enjoying myself more than I had expected. This Ethan was thoughtful, engaged, and genuinely interested in my perspective, not as an extension of himself or a connection to be leveraged, but as a person in my own right. I owe you an apology, he said as we lingered over coffee. Not just for my family's behavior, but for my own. I didn't stand up for you when I should have. I didn't value what you were building because I was too caught up in my own insecurities. We both made mistakes, I acknowledged. I was so focused on proving your family wrong that I sometimes lost sight of our partnership. Do you think, he began, then hesitated. Do you think we could try again? Not pick up where we left off, but start something new, knowing what we know now? It was a complicated question with no simple answer. The hurt and resentment that had characterized the end of our marriage had faded, but the lessons remained. We had both grown, but in different directions. Could those paths converge? Again in a healthy way? I don't know, I said honestly. But I'm open to finding out, slowly. Ethan reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. Slowly works for me. In the months that followed, Ethan and I cautiously rebuilt our relationship on new foundations. We were both busy with our respective careers, which paradoxically gave our reconnection room to breathe. There was no pressure, no timeline, just two people getting to know each other again. Meanwhile, the Richard and Patricia Powell Foundation for First Generation Achievement launched with considerable fanfare. The initial press release highlighted my role as a founding board member and featured my own journey from scholarship student to successful entrepreneur. Richard, true to his word, had funded the foundation generously and stepped back to let a qualified director, a first-generation, college graduate with extensive nonprofit experience, take the lead. At the foundation's inaugural gala, I found myself sharing a table with the entire Powell family. Patricia, elegant as ever but warmer than I remembered. Richard, still commanding but with a new humility. Blake, proudly introducing his boyfriend. To the family for the first time. Whitney, animated as she described her latest legal victory. And even Abigail, making a visible effort to engage with guests from backgrounds vastly different from her own. As I observed this transformed family, dynamic, Aunt Cordelia slid into the empty chair beside me. Quite a sight, isn't it? She remarked, nodding toward the Powells. You know, in all my 70-plus years in this family, I've never seen them so human. I smiled. People can change when properly motivated. Some people, Cordelia corrected with a knowing look. The ones with enough sense to recognize when they're wrong. You should be proud, Morgan. You didn't just build a successful company, you helped reshape an entire family's worldview. I just stood my ground, I demurred. Exactly, she said, patting my hand. Sometimes that's the most revolutionary act of all. As the evening progressed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. From that humiliating Thanksgiving when I was mistaken for the help, to sitting at a gala where the Powell family not only acknowledged my achievements, but actively sought my guidance, it was a transformation I could never have imagined. The ultimate irony wasn't lost on me. The family that had once dismissed me based on my background now depended on me for their legacy, their son's career, and their philanthropic identity. But what satisfied me most wasn't the reversal of fortune or the sweet taste of vindication. It was the knowledge that I had remained true to myself throughout. I hadn't compromised my values or changed my identity to fit their mold. Instead, I had forced them to expand their definition of what constituted worth and merit. As I prepared to take the stage to give remarks about the Foundation's mission, I caught Ethan's eye across the room. He smiled, not the confident, slightly entitled smile of the man I'd married, but something more genuine, more earned. I smiled back, uncertain what the future held for us, but open to the possibility that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead exactly where we need to go. The Foundation Gala marked a turning point in my relationship with the Powell family. But the real test came 6 months later when Thanksgiving rolled around again. 5 years had passed since that fateful dinner where I'd been relegated to serving dessert like a member of the household staff. Now, the dynamic couldn't have been more different. Patricia called me personally to extend the invitation. "We'd love to have you join us for Thanksgiving, Morgan, if you're comfortable with that, of course." The hesitation in her voice was new, a recognition that I had every right to decline, that my presence was requested, not expected. "Thank you for the invitation," I said, deliberately taking a moment before responding. "I'd like to think about it." "Of course," Patricia replied quickly. "And please know that we completely understand if you'd prefer not to." That acknowledgement of my agency, my right to protect myself from potential discomfort, was what ultimately swayed me to accept. That, and a conversation with Blake. "They're actually nervous about it," he told me with a hint of amazement when I mentioned the invitation. "Mom spent an entire dinner last week worrying about the seating arrangements and making sure there wouldn't be anything that might make you uncomfortable." Patricia Powell, concerned about someone else's comfort? "That's new," Blake laughed. "Tell me about it. Dad keeps asking me what your favorite foods are, as if that's going to make up for past behavior. It's weird, but I think it's genuine." Ethan was more cautious when I asked for his perspective. Our rekindled relationship was progressing slowly, but steadily. We were dating exclusively again, though we maintained separate residences and independent lives. "Do you want to go?" he asked, focusing on my feelings rather than his family's expectations. "Because if you do, I'd love to have you there. But if you don't, we could make our own Thanksgiving tradition." His willingness to prioritize my comfort over family obligations spoke volumes about how much he had changed. 5 years ago, declining a Powell family event would have been unthinkable to him. "I think I want to go," I decided. Not to make a point, or because I feel obligated, but because it feels like closing a circle somehow. The Powell mansion looked much the same as I remembered it, imposing colonial architecture, manicured grounds, tasteful holiday decorations. But stepping through the front door felt entirely different. Richard greeted us himself, his handshake, warm and firm. "Morgan, thank you for coming. It means more than I can adequately express." Patricia appeared beside him, elegant in a simple cashmere sweater rather than the ostentatious cocktail dress I remembered from years ago. "Welcome, Morgan. Your cranberry sauce has a place of honor on the table." It was such a specific acknowledgement of that first slight, when she had dismissed my homemade contribution, that I found myself momentarily speechless. She had remembered, and more importantly, she had recognized the hurt she had caused. The house was full of familiar faces, Blake, and his now fiancé David, Whitney and her husband, Abigail and her family, Aunt Cordelia holding court by the fireplace. But there were new faces, too. Colleagues from Richard's foundation, friends of Whitney's from her public defender work, even one of Blake's developers, from Taylor Tech. The Powell Thanksgiving was no longer an insular family affair, but a genuine community gathering with diversity that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Dinner was served family style, with everyone passing dishes around, the table rather than being served by staff. I noticed Patricia herself bringing out platters from the kitchen, assisted by Abigail. When it came time for dessert, Richard stood to address the table. Before we enjoy these amazing pies, I want to take a moment to express my gratitude. Not just for the usual blessings of health and prosperity, but for second chances and hard lessons learned. His gaze found mine across the table. Some people come into our lives and change us fundamentally, if we're wise enough to let them. Morgan, thank you for giving this family the opportunity to become better versions of ourselves. The silence that followed was weighted with emotion. 5 years ago, I had been an unwelcome outsider at this table. Now I was being acknowledged as a catalyst for positive change. Ethan reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it gently. "Too much," he whispered. I shook my head slightly. Richard's words were effusive, perhaps, but they felt sincere. And there was something profoundly healing about having my impact acknowledged in the very space where I had once been diminished. After dinner, as guests mingled in the living room, Abigail approached me with 2 glasses of wine, offering one to me. Her gesture was tentative, lacking the confident entitlement I remembered. "I've been wanting to talk to you one-on-one," she said, leading me toward a quiet corner. "I owe you an apology that's 5 years overdue." "You don't have to," I began, but she shook her head. "I do, actually. I was cruel to you, Morgan. Not just thoughtless or snobbish, but deliberately cruel. I laughed at your background, treated you like you were beneath us, and made no effort to know you as a person." Her directness caught me off guard. Of all the Powells, Abigail had been the most overtly dismissive of me from the beginning. "What changed?" I asked, genuinely curious about her transformation. Abigail took a sip of her wine, gathering her thoughts. "A lot of things. Dad's heart. Attack was a wake-up call for all of us. Seeing Blake so happy working at your company. But honestly, it was something Whitney said to me after you turned down my lunch invitation years ago." I raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. "She asked me if I had ever accomplished anything completely on my own merit, without the Powell name or money opening doors, and I couldn't think of a single example." Abigail's voice wavered slightly. "That was a difficult realization." "What did you do with that realization?" I asked, more interested in her response than in accepting her apology. "I went back to school," she said with a hint of pride. "Got a master's in nonprofit management. I'm running a literacy program in underserved Boston neighborhoods now. It's the hardest and most rewarding thing I've ever done." We talked for nearly an hour, and I discovered layers to Abigail I never would have guessed existed. Behind the polished society daughter facade was a woman with genuine intelligence and newly discovered compassion, who was using her privilege to create meaningful change rather than simply maintaining her social status. As the evening wound down, I found myself in the kitchen, helping Patricia and Whitney with the last of the cleanup, despite their protests that I should relax with the eye. Other guests. "Old habits," I joked as I dried a crystal glass. "Once the help, always the help." Patricia flinched visibly at the reference, but Whitney burst out laughing. "Morgan, you didn't." Patricia's discomfort lasted only a moment before she joined, in the laughter, albeit more reservedly. "I deserved that," she admitted, "and probably a great deal more." "Water under the bridge," I assured her, surprised to find I meant it. The hurt and humiliation of that first Thanksgiving had lost its sting, transformed into something more like a battle scar. evidence of what I had overcome rather than a wound that still pained me. Later that night, as Ethan drove us back to my apartment in Boston, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past 5 years. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, glancing away from the road briefly to study my expression. "I was just thinking about how different that was from our first Thanksgiving," I said. "Your family has changed so much." "Because of you," Ethan pointed out. "You changed them by refusing to be what they expected, by succeeding on your own terms." "Not just because of me," I corrected him. "People don't change unless they want to, no matter what external pressure they face. Your father's health scare, your own journey, those things created openings for growth that might not have existed otherwise." We lapsed into comfortable silence for a few miles before Ethan spoke again. "I have something to ask you, but I'm not sure if the timing is right." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I've been offered a position with a renewable energy consortium in Boston. Senior leadership role, great team, meaningful work. I'd be based here permanently." "Ethan, that's wonderful," I said sincerely. "Is that the question?" "Because the answer is yes, I think you should take it." He smiled, but shook his head. "That's not the question. Though I appreciate the vote of confidence, I already accepted the position last week." "Then what's your question?" He took a deep breath. "I was wondering if you'd consider us living together again. Not necessarily getting remarried right away, but taking that step toward rebuilding what we had, or rather, building something new." It wasn't entirely unexpected. Our rekindled relationship had been steadily deepening over the past several months. We were no longer the same people who had married years ago, me, eager to prove myself worthy of the Powell name. Him, unconsciously expecting me to adapt to his world rather than creating one together. "I'd need to maintain my own office space," I said after considering the idea. "Someplace I can work late without feeling like I'm neglecting you." Ethan nodded, recognizing this as acceptance with conditions rather than a rejection. "Absolutely. And I'd want the same. A separation between work and home that we didn't have before." "We should look for a new place together," I continued, warming to the idea. "Not your old apartment or mine. Somewhere that's ours, that doesn't carry the history of our previous relationship." "I'd like that," Ethan agreed, his smile widening. "A fresh start in a new space." 2 months later, we moved into a loft in a converted factory building in Cambridge, neutral territory, neither Beacon Hill where Ethan had lived after our separation, nor the South End neighborhood I had claimed as my own. The space was open and airy, with huge windows and none of the traditional architecture that characterized the Powell family homes. We furnished it together, a blend of my contemporary tastes and Ethan's more classic preferences. The result was eclectic but harmonious, much like our reconstructed relationship. Taylor Tech Solutions continued to thrive. We expanded to offices in Chicago and Seattle, and our client list included Fortune 500 companies alongside promising startups. Blake excelled as CTO, implementing innovative approaches that kept us at the forefront of the industry. The Powell Foundation for First-Generation Achievement awarded its first round of scholarships to 50 students across New England. I served on the selection committee, insisting on a holistic approach that valued resilience and determination alongside academic achievements. At the scholarship recipient dinner, I found myself seated beside Richard, watching as a young woman from a small town in Vermont described her dreams of becoming a biomedical engineer. "She reminds me of you," Richard observed quietly. "Same fire in her eyes." "Let's hope she encounters fewer obstacles than I did," I replied. Richard nodded, acknowledging the gentle rebuke. "That's the point of all this, isn't it? To clear the path for the next generation so they don't have to fight the same battles." A year after moving in together, Ethan proposed, not with a family heirloom diamond or grand gesture, but with a simple question asked on an ordinary Tuesday evening as we cooked dinner together in our loft. I think we should get married again, he said as he chopped vegetables for a stir-fry. If you want to, that is. I looked up from the cookbook I was consulting, surprised by the casualness of the proposal. Is this you asking or just thinking out loud? Ethan set down his knife and turned to face me fully. This is me asking. I love you, Morgan. Not the idea of you or what you represent, but the actual person you are. Brilliant, determined, compassionate beneath that tough exterior. I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. Again. It wasn't the sweep me off my feet romance of our first engagement, but it was more real, more grounded in genuine understanding of each other. We had seen each other at our worst and chosen to try again with clear eyes. Yes, I said simply, but on one condition. Name it. No big society wedding this time. Something small, meaningful, with just the people who matter most to us. Ethan's relief was visible. Thank God. I was worried you'd want the whole Powell circus again. We married 6 months later in the courtyard garden of Aunt Cordelia's Cambridge home, with 40 guests in attendance, a stark contrast to our first wedding with its 300 carefully selected attendees chosen more for their social connections than their personal significance. Blake served as Ethan's best man, while my college roommate Sandra, who had been conspicuously uninvited to our first wedding by Patricia, stood as my maid of honor. Richard and Patricia sat in the front row, Richard in a wheelchair as he recovered from a knee replacement, but beaming with genuine happiness. Second chances are rare in this life, Cordelia declared in her toast, raising her glass to us. But third and fourth chances? Those require exceptional people. Morgan, you've taught this old family new tricks, namely, how to recognize true worth and admit when we're wrong. Ethan, you've shown that a Powell can actually grow a spine and chart his own course. I congratulate you both and look forward to whatever you build together. As laughter rippled through the gathering, I caught Patricia dabbing at her eyes with a linen handkerchief. She met my gaze across the table and mouthed 2 words. Thank you. 10 years after that first disastrous Thanksgiving, the memory of being mistaken for the help had transformed from a wound into a milestone, the beginning of a journey that had led not only to professional success, but to personal growth. Couldn't have imagined. The ultimate revenge, I realized, wasn't in making the Powells beg for employment or connection. It was in creating a life so authentically mine that their approval or disapproval became irrelevant. And in doing so, I had inadvertently changed not just my own trajectory, but theirs as well. As Ethan and I moved among our wedding guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, I found myself filled with an unexpected sense of peace. The girl who had once felt she needed to prove herself worthy of the Powell name now understood that the true victory had been in remaining steadfastly myself, and in doing so, helping others discover better versions of themselves too. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated isn't proving your critics wrong. It's living so fully in your own truth that their opinions cease to matter altogether. And if, along the way, those same critics come to recognize their error and seek your guidance, well, that's not revenge. That's growth for everyone involved. 2 years after our second wedding, Taylor Tech Solutions reached a pivotal moment in its growth trajectory. What had begun as a small consulting firm had blossomed into a nationally recognized leader in business technology integration, with over 200 employees across 4 offices. We had just landed our largest contract to date, a complete digital transformation for a century-old manufacturing company with locations in 12 states, when I received an unexpected call from a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. We've been watching Taylor Tech's growth for some time, said the partner. On the phone, a woman named Naomi Chen, whose reputation in the tech investment world was legendary. Your approach to integrating cutting-edge solutions for traditional industries has created a unique market position. We'd like to discuss acquisition possibilities. The offer that followed was staggering. 9 figures, with the potential for me to stay on as CEO for a transitional period before moving into an advisory role. It was the kind of exit most entrepreneurs only dream about, a validation of everything I had built from scratch. I promised to consider the offer and scheduled a follow-up call for the following week. That evening, I shared the news with Ethan, over dinner in our loft. "That's incredible, Morgan," he said, with genuine pride in his voice. "Are you considering it?" I pushed my food around my plate, conflicted. "I don't know. Financially, it's more than I ever imagined possible. But Taylor Tech isn't just a business to me. It's my identity in many ways." Ethan reached across the table to take my hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm behind you completely. But for what it's worth, I don't think Taylor Tech is your identity. It's something you created, yes, but you're more than your company." His perspective gave me pause. There had been a time when my determination to build something successful had been inextricably linked to proving my worth to the Powell family. Now that dynamic has fundamentally changed. What would selling the company mean for me? Freedom? Loss? A new beginning? "I need to talk to Blake," I said, realizing that any decision I made would profoundly impact him as CTO and partial equity holder, and Darius, and the rest of the leadership team. The discussions that followed were intense and thoughtful. Blake, to my surprise, was the most supportive of selling. "We've built something amazing," he said during a private conversation in my office. "But maybe it's time for the next challenge. With this kind of capital, think of what we could create next." His use of "we" wasn't lost on me. The idea that Blake would want to continue our professional partnership regardless of what happened with Taylor Tech was deeply meaningful. After 2 weeks of negotiations and soul-searching, I made my decision. We would sell Taylor Tech Solutions to Naomi's firm with conditions. Our entire team would be retained for at least 3 years. Our client commitments would be honored in full, and Blake would be elevated to President of Operations. As for me, I would stay on as CEO for 1 year, before transitioning to a strategic advisory role. The deal would make me wealthy beyond anything I had imagined when I started the company, and would provide generous payouts to the key employees who had been with me from the early days. The night after signing the final paperwork, Ethan and I celebrated at home rather than going out. We opened a bottle of champagne on our balcony overlooking the Charles River, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant orange and pink. "How does it feel?" Ethan asked, handing me a glass. "To have built something so valuable that people are willing to pay millions for it?" I considered the question carefully. Validating, scary, exhilarating, like closing one chapter and opening another. "Any regrets?" I shook my head. "Not about the company. I built exactly what I set out to build, proved what I needed to prove, to myself more than anyone else. But I do sometimes wonder about the cost." "What do you mean?" I took a sip of champagne, gathering my thoughts. "I was so focused on success, on proving your family wrong, that I missed other things. We lost years together because I couldn't separate my feelings about you from my feelings about the Powells. I put off thinking about having children because the company consumed everything." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Do you want children, Morgan? We've never really discussed it directly." The question hung between us, laden with possibility. In our first marriage, children had been an abstract future concept, something we assumed would happen someday, but never actively planned for. Now, in our late 30s, it felt less like a distant possibility and more like a decision that needed conscious consideration. "I think I do," I admitted. Not because it's expected or because we should, but because I want to build a family with you. A real family based on love and acceptance, not status or appearances." Ethan's smile was tender as he leaned over to kiss me. "I want that too. A family where our kids can be whoever they are, not who anyone expects them to be." The year that followed was transformative in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The transition at Taylor Tech went smoothly, with Blake stepping beautifully into his expanded leadership role while I gradually reduced my day-to-day involvement. The acquisition made headlines in the business press, with several profiles highlighting my journey from small-town scholarship student to tech entrepreneur. One particularly prominent piece in a national business magazine included quotes from Richard Powell, identified as my father-in-law and the founder of the Powell Foundation for First-Generation Achievement, praising my extraordinary vision and tenacity. The irony of Richard publicly celebrating qualities he had once dismissed wasn't lost on me, but I found I could appreciate his genuine evolution without bitterness. "Did you see Dad's quotes in that magazine article?" Ethan asked, when it was published. "He sounded like the president of your fan club." I laughed. Times change. People too, sometimes. 3 months after the acquisition was finalized, I discovered I was pregnant. The timing felt right. A new chapter in life opening just as another was closing. When we shared the news with the Powell family, their joy was genuine and uncomplicated. Patricia immediately began planning a nursery in their home for when we would visit. "Not too much pink or blue," she assured me, displaying a progressive attitude that would have been unthinkable in the Patricia I first met. "Children should have options beyond traditional expectations." Even Abigail, once my harshest critic, showed surprising excitement about becoming an aunt. "The baby will have the most extensive library of children's books in New England," she promised, explaining that her literacy program had connections with all the major publishers. Whitney, practical as always, offered legal services to ensure our wills and trusts were properly updated. "Protecting the next generation is what I do," she said simply. Richard's response was perhaps the most unexpected. He asked for a private word with me during a family dinner, leading me to his study, a room I had never been invited into during my first marriage to Ethan. "I want to show you something," he said, retrieving a document from his desk drawer. "This is the updated trust. For my grandchildren. I've restructured it. The original Powell Family Trust had been a frequent source of tension in my first marriage to Ethan. The provisions had been archaic, with inheritance contingent on a complex web of expectations and requirements that reflected generations of Powell family values, most of which centered on maintaining social status and financial control. "I've simplified everything," Richard explained, handing me the document. "Equal shares for all grandchildren, accessible at age 25 with no strings attached. No conditions about schools attended, professions chosen, or family names maintained." As I scanned the pages, I saw that he was right. The manipulative legacy planning had been replaced with something straightforward and fair. "Why show this to me specifically?" I asked. Richard settled heavily into his leather chair, the weight of his years momentarily visible in the set of his shoulders. "Because you're the one who made me see how harmful the old approach was. Using money to control family members, to force them into predetermined paths. It cost me Blake's trust for years. Nearly cost me Ethan. I don't want to make the same mistakes with the next generation." His candor was striking. This wasn't the imperious patriarch who had dismissed my background at our first meeting, but a man who had been humbled by experience and was trying, genuinely, to do better. "Thank you for showing me this," I said simply. "There's one more thing," Richard added. "The trust includes a special education fund for first-generation college students in Lakewood, Michigan, a separate endowment named after your parents." The gesture was so unexpected, so perfectly tailored to acknowledge my roots rather than diminish them, that I found myself momentarily speechless. "You didn't have to do that," I finally managed. "No," Richard agreed. "But I wanted to. Your parents raised a remarkable daughter without the advantages I took for granted. They deserve to be honored for that." As my pregnancy progressed, I found myself with time to reflect in ways that hadn't been possible during the relentless pace of building Taylor Tech. Freed from 60-hour work weeks and constant business travel, I rediscovered other parts of myself, interests and passions that had been set aside in pursuit of professional success. I began mentoring female entrepreneurs through a program specifically designed for women from non-traditional backgrounds. Working with these ambitious young women reminded me of my own early days, but with a crucial difference. They had visible role models and support systems that hadn't existed when I was starting out. "Your story is what keeps me going when investors won't take me seriously," one mentee told me. "If you could build a multi-million-dollar company despite being treated like the help by your in-laws, I can handle a few condescending venture capitalists." I winced at the reference. I had never publicly shared the details of that first Thanksgiving with the Powells, but the young woman quickly explained. "Blake mentioned it in a talk he gave at my business school," she clarified. "He uses it as an example of how privileged families often miss recognizing talent when it doesn't come in expected packages." It was really powerful, especially coming from someone who acknowledges he was part of the problem. The idea that my experience had become a teaching moment, a cautionary tale shared by Blake himself to illustrate the cost of elitism, was unexpectedly moving. In my 7th month of pregnancy, Whitney approached me with a proposition that caught me off guard. She had been appointed to a state commission on higher education accessibility and wanted my input on policy recommendations. "We're looking at barriers for first-generation students and entrepreneurs," she explained over lunch. "Not just financial barriers, but social and cultural ones too. Your perspective would be invaluable." "I'm not a policy expert," I pointed out. Whitney shrugged. "Neither are most of the commissioners. What we need are people with lived experience and practical insights. You have both." What began as occasional input evolved into a more formal role after our daughter, Eliza Grace, was born. Named for my grandmother, a teacher who had instilled in my father the value of education that he had passed on to me, she arrived on a snowy February morning, perfect and pink and entirely her own person from the first moment. As I held her, with Ethan beside me equally awestruck, I felt a profound sense of completion. The circle that had begun with that humiliating Thanksgiving had somehow led here, to a life richer and more authentic than anything I could have planned. When Eliza was 6 months old, I accepted a formal appointment to the state's Commission on Higher Education and Entrepreneurship. My first major initiative was a program connecting established companies with student entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds, providing mentorship and networking opportunities that leveled the playing field in subtle but important ways. The FOO, Morgan Taylor Pathway Program, Whitney announced at the press conference revealing the initiative, named for a woman who built her own pathway when traditional doors were closed to her. The program quickly gained traction, with companies across the state signing on to participate. Among the first corporate sponsors was Powell Properties, now led by a professional management team with Richard serving as chairman emeritus. At the launch event, Richard approached me with Eliza in his arms. At 10 months old, she had him thoroughly wrapped around her tiny finger, a transformation I found both amusing and touching. "I've been thinking about legacy lately," he said, bouncing Eliza gently as she grabbed at his tie, not the kind measured in buildings or bank accounts but in impact, the kind that matters. "And what conclusions have you reached?" I asked. "That the most important parts of my legacy are standing in this room," he said, looking from me to Ethan, to Blake to Whitney, and finally to little Eliza. "And that without your influence, Morgan, that legacy would be poorer in every meaningful way." Coming from Richard Powell, once the embodiment of old money elitism, these words represented a journey, as profound as my own. From dismissing me as unworthy of his son's attention to recognizing my value, not just as a business success, but as a catalyst for positive change within his family. It was a transformation I never could have anticipated. On Thanksgiving that year, we gathered at our Cambridge loft rather than the Powell mansion. It was a deliberate choice, creating new traditions that honored both our families equally. My parents flew in from Michigan, meeting the extended Powell clan in a setting where they could interact as equals rather than as curiosities from my humble origins. The dinner was potluck style, with each family member contributing a dish. Patricia brought her famous Parker House rolls, prepared by her own hands rather than her household staff. My mother brought her cranberry sauce, the same recipe I had attempted to contribute at that first disastrous Thanksgiving. As conversations flowed around the table, Blake and my father deep in discussion about educational reform, Whitney and my mother exchanging gardening tips, Abigail helping Eliza with her mashed potatoes. I caught Ethan watching me with a soft smile. "Happy?" he asked quietly. I surveyed the scene, this blended family that had overcome judgment and prejudice to find genuine connection, this life that had evolved beyond revenge or validation into something authentic and meaningful. "Beyond happy," I replied. "Grateful." The girl who had once been mistaken for the help had not only built a successful business and commanded respect from those who had dismissed her, but had found something more valuable in the process: the confidence to define success on her own terms, the wisdom to allow for growth and change in others, and the joy of creating a life measured not by external validation, but by genuine fulfillment. It turned out that the sweetest revenge wasn't making the Powells beg for employment or connection. It was building a life so grounded in authentic value that I no longer needed their approval, and in the process, helping them discover what truly mattered beyond the narrow confines of status and tradition. As Eliza's laughter rang out across the table, bridging generations and backgrounds with its simple joy, I realized that this moment of genuine connection across differences once thought insurmountable was the true victory, far sweeter and more enduring than any revenge could ever be. 3 years passed like the turning of pages in a well-loved book. Eliza grew from a babbling toddler into a spirited preschooler with her father's charm and my determination. The Pathway program expanded to 5 additional states, creating opportunities for hundreds of first-generation students and entrepreneurs. My advisory role with Taylor Tech's new parent company had evolved into a board position, allowing me to maintain connection with the company I'd built while exploring new ventures. Blake had been promoted to CEO after the 1-year transition period, turning what had once been my small consulting firm into a technology powerhouse with over 500 employees. "We're considering an expansion into international markets," Blake told me during one of our monthly lunch meetings. "Starting with Toronto and London, then possibly Singapore. The board wanted me to get your thoughts before making any firm decisions." It was gratifying to still be valued for my input, but equally satisfying to see Blake confidently leading the company in new directions. From the quiet Powell sibling who had been dismissed by his father to a respected tech executive charting his own course, his transformation had been as profound as any in the Powell family. "Trust your instincts," I advised him. "You've earned the right to make these calls without my approval." Blake smiled, the confidence in his expression a far cry from the hesitant young man who had nervously asked for a job years ago. "I know, but I still value your perspective. Always will." Life had settled into a rhythm that balanced family, professional commitments, and personal growth. Ethan had risen to an executive position in his renewable energy firm, finding fulfillment in work that aligned with his values rather than his family's expectations. We had moved from our Cambridge loft to a comfortable house in Brookline with a yard where Eliza could play and enough space for my parents to stay comfortably when they visited from Michigan. The Powell family dynamics continued to evolve in ways I never could have predicted when I first entered their world. Patricia had discovered a passion for early childhood education, volunteering regularly at a preschool in an underserved Boston neighborhood. Richard, semi-retired but still actively involved with the foundation, had become an unlikely advocate, For economic diversity in corporate boardrooms, Abigail's literacy program had grown into a respected nonprofit with programs across New England, while Whitney had been appointed to a judgeship in the family court system, where she focused on creating more equitable outcomes for families of all backgrounds. Aunt Cordelia, now in her 80s but sharp as ever, had taken up painting and displayed surprising talent. Her Boston townhouse walls, once covered in ancestral portraits and traditional landscapes, now showcased vibrant abstract canvases that reflected her liberated spirit. "Life's too short to be confined by other people's expectations," she told me when I admired a particularly bold composition. "Took me 7 decades to figure that out, but better late than never." On Eliza's 4th birthday, we hosted a party in our backyard. The guest list reflected the blended world we had created. Powell family members alongside my parents and childhood friends, colleagues from my various professional endeavors, Ethan's team from the renewable energy company, and of course, Eliza's, preschool friends and their parents. As I watched my daughter blow out her candles, surrounded by this diverse gathering of people who might never have connected if not for the unlikely journey that began with that fateful Thanksgiving, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not the vindictive satisfaction of seeing former adversaries humbled, but the deeper contentment of having helped create something genuinely good from initially difficult circumstances. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Eliza was asleep surrounded by new toys, Ethan and I sat on our back porch with glasses of wine. "I have news," he said quietly, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Good news or concerning news?" I asked, immediately attentive to his tone. "Unexpected news." He took a breath. "My team has been approached about a potential partnership with a major European energy conglomerate. It would mean establishing a research center focused on next-generation solar technology." "That sounds amazing," I said, genuinely impressed. "Why the hesitation?" "Because the research center would be in Copenhagen. They want me to head it up, which would mean relocating there for at least 2 years. The proposal hung between us, weighty with implications. Moving to Denmark would mean uprooting our carefully constructed life in Boston, Eliza's preschool, my work with the Commission and the Pathway program, our proximity to both of our families. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked when I didn't immediately respond. I considered the question carefully. 5 years ago, I might have viewed this opportunity through the lens of competition or sacrifice. What would I be giving up? What would I be losing? But perspective had changed me as much as it had changed the Powells. "I think we should consider it seriously," I said. "It's an incredible opportunity for you professionally, and potentially a wonderful experience for Eliza. Children her age adapt quickly, and being exposed to a different culture and language would be valuable." Ethan looked relieved, but still cautious. "What about your work?" "Much of what I do can be managed remotely, at least partially. The Commission meets quarterly, and board responsibilities don't require daily presence. The Pathway program is established enough now that it doesn't need my constant attention." I reached for his hand. "Besides, maybe it's time for me to explore something new as well. You'd be willing to do that? To put my career first for a while?" I squeezed his hand. "It's not about putting your career first. It's about recognizing that we're partners in this life we're building. Sometimes one of us will take the lead, sometimes the other. The important thing is supporting each other's growth." Over the next few months, we carefully evaluated the Copenhagen opportunity, weighing professional benefits against family considerations. We visited the city to get a feel for neighborhoods and international schools, and I connected with several Danish tech firms and educational institutions to explore potential collaborations. Richard and Patricia's reaction to our potential move surprised me. Rather than expressing disappointment or attempting to dissuade us, they were supportive and practical. "We'll visit often," Patricia promised, "and you'll have a home base here whenever you need it." Richard, ever the businessman, even in retirement, had already researched Danish business culture and tax implications. "I've put together some information that might be useful," he said, handing me a meticulously organized folder. "And I've reached out to a couple of business contacts in Copenhagen who can help you get settled." My parents were more emotional about the prospect of their only grandchild moving overseas, but ultimately encouraging. "You've never been afraid to take risks for the right reasons," my father said. "We're proud of you for supporting Ethan the way he's supported you." The decision to accept the Copenhagen position wasn't made lightly, but in the end, it felt right for our family at this stage of our lives. As we prepared for the move, I reflected on how far we had all come from that first Thanksgiving where I had been mistaken for help. The night before our departure, the entire extended family gathered for a farewell dinner at our Brookline home. As I looked around the table at these people who had once seemed so foreign to me and to whom I had seemed equally alien, I was struck by how the boundaries between us had dissolved over time, replaced by genuine affection and respect. "I propose a toast," Richard said, rising from his seat with some effort, his health having declined further in recent months. "To Morgan and Ethan, who have taught this old man more about courage and adaptation than a lifetime in business ever did. May your Copenhagen adventure bring you growth, joy, and new perspectives to share when you return to us." As glasses were raised around the table, I caught Blake's eye. He winked at me, a silent acknowledgement of the unlikely journey that had brought us all to this moment. From being mistaken for the help to being celebrated as family as I embarked on a new international chapter, the transformation was complete. The next morning, as our car pulled away from the house with luggage packed for our new adventure, I didn't look back with regret or forward with trepidation. Instead, I held Ethan's hand in mine and Eliza's small fingers in the other, grounded in the knowledge that home wasn't defined by geography or family name, but by the authentic connections we create and nurture wherever life might take us. Copenhagen embraced us with its blend of historic charm and progressive mindset. We settled into a spacious apartment in Østerbro, a family-friendly neighborhood with tree-lined streets and proximity to parks. Eliza adapted with the remarkable resilience of childhood, picking up Danish phrases faster than either Ethan or I could manage, and making friends at her international preschool with effortless enthusiasm. "More, jeg har lært noget nyt I dag," she would announce proudly, eager to share each new Danish word or concept she'd absorbed. Ethan thrived at the research center, his work on next-generation solar technology earning recognition throughout the European renewable energy community. The freedom from his family's shadow, both geographical and psychological, allowed him to fully step into his expertise without the weight of the Powell legacy influencing how colleagues perceived him. My own professional transition proved more complex but ultimately rewarding. I maintained my board positions remotely, scheduling quarterly trips back to Boston for in-person meetings. The Pathway program continued its expansion under capable leadership, though I remained actively involved in strategic planning through video conferences and occasional visits. What surprised me was how quickly I found new opportunities in Denmark. The Danish business community, with its emphasis on innovation and sustainability, welcomed my experience in tech transformation. Within 6 months, I was advising several Danish companies on digital strategy and serving on a government task force focused on integrating technology education into public schools. "You've become our unofficial American ambassador," joked Henrik Larsson, the education minister who had recruited me for the task force. "Though I suspect you understand the Danish approach to innovation better than many Danes." Our life developed a pleasant rhythm, Ethan absorbed in his research, Eliza flourishing in her international environment, and me balancing remote American commitments with new Danish ventures. We explored Copenhagen on weekends, taking Eliza to Tivoli Gardens and the National Museum, gradually feeling less like visitors and more like residents. The Powell family, true to their word, visited regularly. Patricia and Richard came quarterly, staying in a hotel nearby despite our offers to host them. They had evolved from the controlling in-laws of years past into respectful guests who valued our boundaries while genuinely enjoying their time with us. I never imagined myself spending my 70s exploring Scandinavian museums, Richard remarked during one visit as we strolled through the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art, north of Copenhagen. But I find I rather enjoy it. Patricia had developed an unexpected affinity for Danish design, filling their Boston home with sleek furniture and minimalist decor that would have been unthinkable in the traditionally appointed Powell mansion I had first encountered. The clarity of purpose in Danish design speaks to me, she explained. No unnecessary ornamentation, just beautiful functionality. Perhaps that's my own evolution, learning to value substance over appearance. Blake visited twice that first year, combining business exploration for Taylor Tech's European expansion with family time. He had grown into a confident executive, respected in the industry not just as my successor, but as an innovative leader in his own right. We're opening the London office next quarter, he shared during a dinner at our apartment. And Toronto is already exceeding projections. The acquisition gave us the capital to expand, but it's the foundation you built that made it possible to scale so successfully. Whitney and her husband visited in the summer with their newly adopted twins, creating a joyful chaos as Eliza proudly showed her younger cousins around her favorite city spots. Even Abigail made the journey, bringing her teenage children who were initially skeptical about the boring family trip, but quickly became enchanted with Copenhagen's blend of history and modernity. My parents spent an entire month with us, my father delighting in the Danish emphasis on education and social welfare, my mother exploring the city's markets and learning to cook traditional Danish dishes alongside Eliza. This experience is giving our granddaughter perspectives we could never have imagined for her, my father observed as we watched Eliza play with children from a dozen different countries in a neighborhood park. What a gift you're giving her. As our 2-year commitment approached its conclusion, Ethan received an unexpected offer. The European conglomerate was so pleased with the research center's progress that they proposed establishing a permanent institute with Ethan as its director, extending our stay indefinitely. It's a tremendous opportunity, Ethan acknowledged as we discussed the possibility one evening after Eliza was asleep. But it's not just my decision. Your career, Eliza's education, our families back home, there's so much to consider. We weighed the options carefully. Returning to Boston would mean slipping back into familiar routines and closer proximity to aging parents. Staying in Copenhagen offered continued growth in a culture we had come to deeply appreciate, along with educational opportunities for Eliza that aligned with our values. What does your heart tell you? I asked Ethan, recognizing that this decision needed to be guided by more than just professional considerations. That I'm doing the most meaningful work of my career here, he admitted. That I love who we are as a family in this context. But I don't want to be selfish. Your work, your connections back home. I've found meaningful work here too, I reminded him. Different from building Taylor Tech, but fulfilling in new ways. And connections can be maintained across oceans, as we've proven these past 2 years. After many conversations and careful consideration, we decided to extend our Copenhagen chapter for another 3 years, with annual reassessment. It wasn't a forever commitment, but it acknowledged that our international experience had enriched our lives in unexpected ways that we weren't ready to relinquish. The most challenging aspect of our decision was sharing it with Richard and Patricia. Richard's health had continued to decline, and though he never complained or pressured us, we were acutely aware that time with him was precious and limited. We flew to Boston to deliver the news in person, preparing ourselves for disappointment or subtle manipulation. Instead, we found acceptance that highlighted just how profoundly the Powell family dynamic had evolved. "We'll miss you terribly," Patricia acknowledged, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But we've seen how you've thrived there. We would never ask you to compromise that." Richard, frailer than when we'd last seen him but still sharp-minded, nodded in agreement. The Powell legacy was always about building something meaningful. What you're doing there honors that legacy more than your physical presence here ever could. Their genuine support, free from conditions or guilt, was perhaps the most tangible evidence of how far we had all traveled from that first Thanksgiving dinner, where family legacy was wielded as a weapon rather than offered as a gift. We returned to Copenhagen with clear consciences and renewed appreciation for our life there. Eliza started at an international school. Ethan's research institute secured substantial new funding, and I accepted a position on the board of a Danish tech education foundation while maintaining my connection to the Pathway program back home. Then came the call we had been dreading. Richard, whose health had been gradually failing, had taken a sudden turn for the worse. The doctors predicted weeks, not months. We arranged immediate flights back to Boston, arriving at Massachusetts General Hospital to find the Powell family gathered in somber vigil. Richard, diminished physically but lucid, brightened visibly when we entered his room. "Ah, the Copenhagen contingent arrives," he said, his voice weaker but his spirit undimmed. "Come closer. Let me see how Scandinavian living has changed you." Eliza, now 6 and fluent in both English and Danish, approached her grandfather's bedside without fear, taking his papery hand in her small one. "Far, she said, using the Danish word for paternal grandfather. "I brought you something." She placed a small carved wooden Viking ship in his palm, a souvenir she had selected herself from a Danish craft market. Richard examined it with genuine interest, asking Eliza questions about Vikings and Danish history, listening intently to her enthusiastic explanations. The interaction was so natural, so free of the artifice that had characterized the Powell family when I first encountered them, that I found myself blinking back tears. Over the next 2 weeks, we stayed in Boston as Richard's condition stabilized temporarily before resuming its inevitable decline. During this time, the extended Powell family maintained a rotating presence at the hospital, providing Patricia with support and ensuring Richard was rarely alone. One afternoon, when most of the family had stepped out to get lunch, I found myself alone with Richard in his hospital room. He was having a good day, his mind clear though his body continued to fail him. "Morgan," he said, gesturing for me to come closer to his bedside. "There's something I need to say while I still can." I sat in the chair beside him, taking his frail hand in mine. "I'm listening." "When you first came into this family, I saw you as a threat," he admitted, his gaze direct despite his weakness. "Not just to our social standing, but to everything I thought I had built, a family defined by certain values and traditions." I nodded, neither accepting or rejecting his characterization. "I couldn't have been more wrong," he continued. "What I failed to understand was that traditions that don't evolve become empty rituals. Values that don't accommodate growth become limitations." He paused, gathering strength. "You didn't threaten what was precious about the Powell legacy. You saved it by forcing it to become meaningful again." "Richard," I began, but he shook his head slightly. "Let me finish. I don't have many chances left to speak difficult truths." He drew a labored breath. "That first Thanksgiving, when Patricia treated you like a help, I allowed it. Worse, I tacitly approved it. It reflected a worldview I had accepted without question, that worth was determined by background, by bloodlines, by social connections." The directness of his acknowledgement was startling. We had reached a détente over the years, a mutual respect that had gradually evolved into genuine affection, but neither of us had ever explicitly addressed those early humiliations. "What I've come to understand," Richard continued, "is that real legacy isn't about maintaining status or traditions. It's about impact. The Powell name will mean something worthwhile to future generations, not because of what I built, but because of how you helped transform it into something that contributes rather than merely preserves." "It wasn't just me," I said softly. "Ethan found his own path. Blake discovered his true talents. Whitney always had her own sense of justice. You raised children with the capacity to grow beyond your limitations, even if you didn't recognize it at the time. Richard's smile was tired but genuine. Perhaps, but it took your influence to activate those possibilities. He squeezed my hand, with surprising strength. I'm proud to have you in this family, Morgan. Not because of what you've achieved professionally, though that is remarkable, but because of who you are. I wish I had seen it sooner. 3 days later, Richard Powell passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Patricia at his side. The funeral was held at the historic Boston church where generations of Powells had marked their passages, but the service itself reflected the evolution of the family Richard had led. Speakers included not only family members and business associates, but also beneficiaries of the foundation, employees who had worked with him for decades, and community members whose lives had been touched by his late-in-life philanthropy. Ethan delivered a moving eulogy that acknowledged his father's flaws while celebrating his capacity for growth. My father's greatest strength, he told the assembled mourners, was not his business acumen or his social standing, but his eventual willingness to reconsider deeply held convictions when presented with compelling evidence that they were wrong. Not many people, especially successful ones, develop that capacity late in life. It's a legacy of humility and growth that I hope to continue. After the funeral, as extended family gathered at the Powell home, I found myself in Richard's study with Patricia. She was sorting through some of his personal papers, a task she had insisted on handling herself despite offers of help from her children. He left this for you, she said, handing me an envelope with my name written in Richard's distinctive handwriting. He asked that I give it to you privately. Inside was a brief handwritten note and a legal document. The note read simply, "For the next generation of boundary breakers, with gratitude and respect, Richard." The document detailed the establishment of a new scholarship within the Powell Foundation, the Morgan Taylor Powell Innovation Grant, specifically designed to support entrepreneurs from unconventional backgrounds who showed promise of disrupting traditional industries. He arranged it last month, Patricia explained, her eyes bright with emotion, said it was the most fitting tribute he could imagine, supporting others who might challenge entrenched thinking the way you did. As we prepared to return to Copenhagen after settling Richard's affairs, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner. The memory no longer stung with embarrassment or anger. Instead, it had transformed into something like an origin story, the difficult beginning that had set in motion a series of events leading to growth and transformation for an entire family system. The Powell family that gathered to bid us farewell at Logan Airport bore little resemblance to the entitled, insular clan that had once dismissed me as unworthy. Blake stood with his now husband David, their recent marriage having been joyfully celebrated by the entire family. Whitney discussed her judicial advocacy work with my father, their shared commitment to equity creating an easy rapport. Abigail, once the most judgmental of the siblings, hugged me with genuine affection, making plans to visit Copenhagen with her literacy program's international coordinator. And Patricia, who had once epitomized everything I found toxic about wealth and privilege, held Eliza close and whispered Danish phrases she had been studying secretly, determined to connect with her granddaughter in meaningful ways. As our flight was called, I turned to Ethan, finding in his eyes the same wonder I felt at the journey we had traveled together. "Who would have thought," he said quietly, "that being mistaken for the help would lead here?" "Not me," I admitted with a smile. "But I'm grateful for every step of the path, even the painful ones." Boarding the plane that would carry us back to our Copenhagen life, I reflected on the ultimate irony of my story. I had once been driven by a desire to prove my worth to a family that had dismissed me, to make them regret their judgment and perhaps even beg for my assistance. But the real victory had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The true triumph was in the authentic life we had built, a life guided by values rather than appearances, by contribution rather than status. And in that journey, the Powell family had been transformed from adversaries to allies, from judges to supporters, from a closed system resistant to change into a dynamic network embracing new possibilities. As our plane lifted off from Boston soil, carrying us back to the unexpected new chapter we had embraced in Denmark, I realized that the most profound revenge against those who underestimate you isn't making them recognize their mistake. It's living so fully in your authentic path that their opinion ceases to matter. And in the process, perhaps helping them find their own more authentic way forward too. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.